Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of RPG Radio. My name is Winback and on today's episode we're getting into the elite difficulty with our Conjurer, the bleeding shaman and occultist build focused on smacking people with a big two-handed weapon and making you feel like a god while you do it. Today's video is going to be all about the remaining devotions that we built into this build, and we're going to go over a couple of very easy pieces of gear that you can pick up post level 50. Some of those are going to be legendary, some of those will require that you get all the way up to level 75 though, so if you are not in the elite difficulty at this point, that's going to be your best option for farming those bigger pieces of gear. In order to keep this short and sweet though, we're going to start off with those devotions, and specifically I do want to mention one thing because it's going to be a little bit atypical for what we're used to when it comes to devotion progression. So with this build, you'll want to get 1 point in 4 of the 5 crossroads devotions, and that is going to be your yellow, you're going to take your red or your pink, you're going to take green, and you are going to take purple. The reason that we want all 4 of those right off the bat is because that gives us some pretty solid anchors into devotions that we're going to need for our Oleron's Rage. That is where we're going to end up with the devotion chart, but there are a few in between that really require some diversity. And as we get to that finalizing point, we're actually going to remove 2 of those at a spirit guide, mainly the Eldritch and the Ascendant, because we're going to use those extra points to funnel into Oleron to fully cap them out. That being said though, once you've got your first point into your yellow half, which is your order, you're going to move over to Lion as your first order devotion. Now Lion only requires that you put 3 points in, you only need 1 order affinity in order to access it, and it's going to give you 3 points into your order tree, which is about halfway to the requirement for Oleron. So, that being said, Lion itself is going to give you 4% health, 8 defensive ability, and it's going to give you some pet bonuses. We're not worried again about pet bonuses when it comes to this shaman build, even though it's a possibility, you do not need them. The 8 defensive ability is a little bit small, but that 4% health is going to equate to some big numbers later on in the build. Now the second point is going to give you a flat spirit of 15, you're going to get 100 health to add right to the bottom of your health bar, and you're going to get 6% move speed too, so you can start moving quicker, getting from pack to pack. Your final point for Lion is going to give you 15% to all of your damage and 2% physical resistance, which may seem small, but remember, physical resistance caps out at 40%, so 2% is pretty decent. Now after you have completed your Lion constellation, move on over to Dryad. Dryad requires that you put 5 points in, but the ability that it's going to give you and the remaining 3 affinity that you'll need will get you to a completed half of Oleron. So Dryad, as far as a first point is going to go, you're going to get 15 physique, 200 energy, and 10 poison and acid resistance. That's one of the resistances that is tough to come by in the first place, so having that on a devotion is going to be a buff no matter how you look at it. The second point for Dryad is going to get you 80 health, which is definitely less than the 100, but if we're stacking them up, you can see it's almost 200 health for 2 points into Dryad. You're also getting 1 energy regen per second added to the base level of that, so it's a pretty disappointing point if we're being honest, but can't shake a stick at any base stats. The third point is going to give you a 3% movement speed and a 15% slow resistance, which is something that you don't see a lot, so taking it where you can get it is never a bad deal. Point number 4 is going to get you a 5% to your whole spirit bar, and that's always going to be a good thing. Percent increases to what are basically large numbers are always going to be a huge buff. You're also going to get a minus 10% requirement from your spirit attribute when it comes to equipping things like jewelry and any weapon that has a spiritual requirement. So that's not a stat that you're going to see very often, but if you haven't figured it out just from looking at it, it does pop up on items that you use or you pick up, you're trying to equip at the very bottom. So basically anything that has a spirit requirement, you'll see that the maximum stat, or the stat that you've accrued in reduction of spirit or physique or cunning to use that item, will show up at the bottom of the description. 10's a big number for that stat, so don't ignore it, especially if you find yourself a ring or an item that has a spirit requirement on it. You can thank the Dryad for making that easier to equip. Not only that, but Dryad has a 4% increase to your physical resistance at the 4th point in the devotion, which is super helpful because that plus lion puts us at 6% physical resistance just from devotions that we're talking about in this video. Now the final point into Dryad is going to give you the Dryad's Blessing, and when this goes off, it has a almost 3-second skill recharge with a 10-second duration that comes with a 10% plus 800-ish health restored, which is fantastic, and a big chunk in armor, which is 70 at level 25, and you're going to get a reduction in both bleeding and poison duration, so if you have any of that stuff going on, you're going to cut it by about a third. So Dryad's Blessing is incredibly helpful for random sporadic healing, and you'll remember from Mogdrogan that we're increasing the healing that this build can do. So the more that we can get that spread out on different abilities, the more healing that we can buff from different sources, means the happier our health bar is going to be. Dryad's Blessing does activate on a 33% chance, so it should be pretty easy to activate consistently when you need yourself a heal. Go ahead and equip it to whatever you can find. There are quite a few options, but don't be afraid to equip it to your metal ability, because hopping around and smacking people and then getting a big heal for it is always a good feeling. Now, what's the exact opposite of order? It's chaos. So the left side of your crossroads tree is going to be that pink or red, and that affinity, that single point into that crossroad, is going to give you access to one of the better devotions in this build, and that is the Huntress. Now, Huntress is a very big commitment of points with a whopping 7 required to get the maximum use case, but I promise you that it is worth it. So, your first point into Huntress is going to give you some very favored shaman stats with a 200 flat increase to your base health and 15 offensive ability. We're making sure that we can get those crits because they are going to be important for Oleron later. The second point is going to give you 50% increase to your pierce damage, which is fine. It's not like that's doing any damage to our build, it's just a stat that we don't care about. Plus 20 cunning on top of that, which we do very much care about because that is directly increasing our bleeding damage and our opportunities to crit. Fantastic stat. Always, always, always take the buffs for cunning. As far as your third point goes, you're getting a 60% buff to your bleeding damage along with another 15 offensive ability, meaning that we've got 30 just from this devotion and 3 points. Your fourth point is going to be up to you. You can go 2 directions. If you want to get to Rend, which is the ability for the Huntress quicker, you're going to take the middle of her bow point, and this point is going to give you a 3% to your offensive ability. Huge increase if you have that already at a high number, along with 25 additional health regenerated per second and further increasing your healing effects by 12%. So the healing effects that we're getting from Mogdrogan and the Huntress together are giving us a combined 32% increase on all the healing that we do, including the Dryad that we just picked up shortly before this one. Now, the other point that you can take, if you're not too worried about getting to the Rend ability quicker, you can take the point that will give you 8% increased damage to all beasts. It's going to give you 250 additional health to your base, and you're going to get 8% pierce resistance on top of that. Always appreciate your resistance buffs from your devotions, because getting them on armor and forcing you to use augments and components does pigeonhole your build a little bit as you get higher up in the difficulty. Now, the remaining point here that is not your ability for Rend is going to give you 45 bleeding damage right to the base. So that bleeding damage is over 3 seconds. You're also going to get another 50% buff to that bleeding damage and a 20% increase to the duration of it. So the damage that the bleeding is doing per tick is increased, and the amount of ticks that it can do is increased as well. So all around, huge buff for your bleeding damage right from the foundation. Now, Rend, the ability for the Huntress, activates at a 20% chance, and it goes off for 5 seconds in a 5-meter radius. The bleeding damage that this is going to do is right around 285 at level 20. It's also going to reduce targets' offensive ability by 150, meaning that you will be even harder for them to hit and to crit. We're also going to reduce their bleeding resistance by 32%, again at level 20, and we're going to make all the damage that we do in this build that much more potent, because these guys are going to have that bleeding resistance shredded almost all the time. Rend is incredibly easy to activate. Even though it's only on a 20% chance, we're going to go ahead and equip this to our Grasping Vines, because they are on a very short cooldown and hit in a very big AoE over a very big period of time. You can activate this all the time with this build, and that is the biggest perk of the Huntress plus the Grasping Vines combo. It is also at this stage that you can remove the points in your crossroads of your Ascendant and your Eldritch trees. If you need extra points to put into the Huntress, you can totally access those, because a lot of the all of the constellations actually on your Ascendant and Eldritch side of this build will be able to rely on themselves for staying afloat. So if you ever get to the point where you want to redo these devotions, you'll need to put those back into their crossroads, or you can just use a potion, reset them all, and go from the beginning. But at this exact moment in your build, if you have those two in the crossroads still, and you want to get 2 extra easy devotion points to complete a crossroads, there you have it. Now, after you're done with Huntress, we're going to go pick up one more on our way to Oleron, which will get us to that 20 Ascendant affinity requirement that he has, and that is going to be the Owl. Owl gives you 5 affinity, and you're going to start off with a point giving you both 15 to Cunning, which is our favorite attribute, and 15 to Spirit, which is also nothing to shake a stick at. After that, the second point is going to give you 8% elemental resistance, which again is 8% into your cold, fire, and lightning resistances, as well as a negative 5% skill energy cost. So that means that all of the abilities that you're using cost 5% less on your energy bar, which is pretty handy, because you may have noticed in this video that we do run dry a little bit when it comes to all the buttons that we can press and how often we can press them. Your third point is going to be up to you. You can go all the way to the south, or you can go a little southeast if you prefer. One of these points is going to give you basically increases to all of your damage over time abilities, and the increase to the amount of time that they deal damage. So that means internal trauma, bleeding, burn, frostburn, electrocute, poison, and vitality decay are all getting a 50% buff to the damage that they do, along with a 20% increase to how long they go. Combine that with the Huntress, and our bleeding duration is now increased by 20% just from the Huntress and 20% from the Owl, meaning that we get 40% total increase just from devotions, which is fantastic, because that's almost 1.5 times what we're used to. Now, the final point in Owl is going to give you a 30% increase to all of your damage, 15 defensive ability, and you are going to take 15% less reflected damage. That's not a resistance that you see very often, but reflected damage does hurt when you're doing astronomical amounts of damage later on in Ultimate. The way that this build works, though, since it's doing a lot of damage over time, you may not notice a lot of that reflected damage really causing a problem. Still, it's a resistance. It's not like it's a bad thing to have ever, but there it is. Now, all of that is leading up to our one final outer constellation, and that is our big angry boy, Oleron. Oleron is the premier physical and bleeding damage constellation, and he is fantastic for everything that we want to do. So, in order to kick this thing off, you are going to get 30 physique and 30 cunning, along with 300 health added to your base. That is just the first point into Oleron, and that is a massive, massive buff, especially for anybody who wants to play a shaman regardless of what build you're going. The second point is going to give you 80% increases to physical, internal trauma, and bleeding damage. If you've been following this build for the last couple videos, you know that all three of those are fantastic opportunities for this build to deal damage, and it sinks in nicely. The third point that you are going to put into Oleron gives you another 30 offensive ability. You're getting 80 armor, and you'll get 10% bleeding resistance. All of those stats have been explained to death at this point, but just remember, you're getting another very big buff from just that point. Now, the fourth point for Oleron is giving you 350 health, along with another 4% physical resistance. So we're at 10% of our physical resistance cap from our devotions alone. That in and of itself is fantastic, because that is a quarter of the journey completed, and we really don't have to try very hard to get extra physical resistance from gear or components or augments, what have you. Your next point for Oleron, you can go one of three directions. If you just want to go ahead and pick up his ability Blind Fury, you can, but if you decide to go to the left instead, you're going to get a flat increase to your physical damage, as well as a 120% buff to that same physical damage, and 100% buff to your bleeding damage. Crazy numbers because it is a big outer constellation, but the northern point for Oleron will give you a flat increase to internal trauma damage of 120 over 5 seconds, along with 120% buff to that same internal trauma damage, with 15 offensive ability to boot, and 2% of your cap for your pierce resistance increased. So once you hit 80, if you also have Oleron chosen and this point unlocked, you're going to go up to 82%, which might not seem like a lot, but it is pretty crazy. Overmax all the resistances that you can all the time, because the further that you decide to go in this game, the more impactful they will be. Now, our final point for Oleron is his ability Blind Fury, and this activates on 100% of a critical attack of the ability that you have assigned to it. That was a lot of words, but basically when you crit with the ability, it's going to activate Oleron's basically big red angry ring of steel. So the way that this works and the way that we're going to use it in this build, you'll actually affix it to your Devouring Swarm. And Devouring Swarm, the reason that we're using that is because it activates in basically a straight line AoE. You can use it very often if you want to get this ability to activate most often, and it can also activate off of the ticks of the Devouring Swarm while that is dealing damage over time to things that you've shot the swarm through. So just remember, the Devouring Swarm is a straight line AoE, it is very big, it is very spammable, and when the Blind Fury activates, it is a very big red circular AoE around you of a 6-meter target area. It's going to do 75% of your weapon damage, which is fantastic because, again, two-handed weapons are your biggest damage pool in the game. You're going to be dealing physical damage with it, internal trauma damage with it, bleeding damage with it, and you're going to slow enemy attacks that are hit by it for 5 seconds. This is a very, very cool ability, and the fact that it can be activated so consistently with this build because of all the damage over time and the spamminess of a lot of our abilities is absolutely chef's kiss. But there you have it. We've officially speed run through all of our devotions, ending on our big boy Oleron, and that should get you quite far into Elite as far as dealing damage goes, having those resistances goes, lots of health increases and utility for your Conjurer. So I highly recommend finishing the devotions as quickly as possible, and if you are like me in this particular playthrough and you've picked up a merit to unlock all of the rift gates throughout the map, that will make farming those devotion points a heck of a lot easier. It's okay if you don't do that. Obviously, merits are only available if you have Forgotten Gods, and you can go talk to the vendor in Act 7 to get them. But if you also enjoy just kind of plodding your way through the map like I do, you don't have to worry about, speed running devotion points for this build to work. If you don't have Oleron, it's a big damage buff for you, but you can still rely pretty heavily on your basic abilities and your gear to carry you quite far. Now there is a couple more pieces of gear that I want to talk about in this video, and they are going to be Elite focused. So once you make it into Elite, once you're around level 70 or so, you should be able to pretty easily compete with all of the enemies in this difficulty. But you'll want to start hunting down a Troll Bone Crusher. Just like I mentioned in that earlier video, Troll Bone Crusher has a lot of very, very big buffs for Savagery and for Feral Hunger, which are very good abilities in our kit. So it's going to just buff the item entirely because the levels increased, you have access to a bunch of new stats, and you have all those same increases to Savagery and Feral Hunger that we mentioned in the previous videos. There are legendary options that you can pick up to replace it, like the Razor Leaf Glaive. You can probably find an empowered version once you start making your way through Elite. But if you have to rely on the Troll Bone Crusher, don't worry about farming other two-handed gear, because honestly, this weapon competes with legendaries specifically for this build. Because of how good it is, because of all the things that it can do, there's a lot of legendary options that I've got sitting in a box right now because they really didn't do enough compared to the Bone Crusher. So don't fret, pick it up if you still want it. I highly recommend it. There is, however, another item I want to talk about, and that is going to be the Relic upgrade. Now, in the last video, I said that Zeal was probably going to carry us all the way to level 90 when we upgraded into the Transcendent Relic, but I did find a decent replacement, and we're going to use that one instead. This is called Oleron's Wrath, and this only has a level 60 requirement. So while we're wasting its +1 to all soldier abilities, it does provide a huge number of buffs. Alternatively, that we can kind of ignore how much we're not being efficient with it. So that being said, Oleron's Wrath, the Relic, is going to give you an increase to your physical damage. It's going to then buff that physical damage, and is going to buff your bleeding damage along with an increase to the duration of that bleeding damage. So you remember from just a couple seconds ago when we're talking about those devotions, we have increased the bleeding damage of the duration of our bleeding damage by almost 100% at this point. We are almost in doubling the duration of our bleeds, which is nuts. And that is just between the Relic and devotions, none of the other gear that we've picked up so far. So after the bleeding duration and bleeding buff increases, you're going to get anywhere from 56 to 84 offensive ability, which is again fantastic because you want to crit as often as possible so that you can activate the Blind Fury devotion ability that we're getting from Oleron. So more crits equals more damage equals more happy. It's just always going to be that simple. Now, the other thing that Oleron's Wrath is going to do for you is an ability in and of itself, and that will activate on a 10% chance of your attacks. That's not a really big mountain to climb because of the sheer volume of attacks that we can do between damage over time, our abilities lasting for so long, and them hitting in really large AoEs. But when Oleron's Wrath goes off, it is going to activate in a 3-meter target area. It's a 1.6 second cooldown and is going to do 25% of your weapon damage along with physical and bleeding damage. The only real problem again that we have with it is that the completion bonus does not benefit us whatsoever because they are soldier benefits, and the +1 to all skills in soldier is also entirely wasted because we don't use that mastery whatsoever. And that is going to do it for me, everybody. Not too many items to talk about because I think that the devotions and the build itself really do well just on their bases. So this build should be able to carry you quite far through Elite, and then when you're ready to shift up into Ultimate, things are going to be pretty simple comparatively to some of the previous builds that we've worked with because of the health that this build is going to have, because of the resistances that we've got built in, and just the sheer volume of damage that we can do. That being said, I will see you next week to finish this bad boy off, and until then, peace out.